It started with a single, whispered message. The kind that sends chills down your spine. The kind that no one wants to hear, yet everyone feels compelled to know. Imagine waking up one morning to a notification that changes everything you thought you knew about your family, your legacy, your world. That's exactly what happened to the people inside the Golden Court, an opulent, tightly controlled royal dynasty where secrets are currency and appearances are life itself. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The palace had been calm, serene even, for decades. Tourists and onlookers admired its gilded gates and manicured lawns, but behind those iron bars and oak doors, the air had always been thick with tension. Courtiers whispered in corridors, servants glanced over their shoulders, and the royals themselves were experts at wearing smiles that masked storms. And yet, nothing could prepare them, or the public, for the news that would erupt like lightning across the kingdom. It began with King Alastair, a monarch who had ruled with careful precision for 30 years. Known for his composed demeanor and strategic brilliance, Alastair was the kind of king who made decisions behind closed doors and revealed only what he wanted the world to see. But that morning, a message had reached him that cut through the decades of calculated control. Prince Louis, the youngest of his heirs, was at the center of a revelation that would shake the royal line to its core. The palace staff were the first to sense that something was off. A normally cheerful lunch in the grand hall became tense and silent. Conversations that were meant to be polite and cordial dissolved into abrupt glances and unfinished sentences. The air carried the electric hum of anticipation, the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. And then came the press. Headlines began to circulate even before the official announcement. Golden Court shock. Young prince's future in question. The public, always ravenous for royal drama, could barely keep up with the rapid-fire revelations. But the question that dominated every conversation, every whispered speculation, and every headline was the same. How could this happen in a family that had spent generations safeguarding its reputation? How could a secret so deeply buried finally emerge? And what would it mean for the young prince whose innocence was now caught in a storm he could not possibly understand? The story, however, was not just about betrayal or scandal. It was about power, legacy, and the fragile nature of truth in a world built entirely on illusion. Prince Louis, though only 8 years old, was already central to a drama that spanned decades, entangling alliances, betrayals, and a series of decisions that now threatened to unravel the very foundation of the Golden Court. He had grown up in a world where every action, every word, every glance was monitored and scrutinized. He had been shielded from the outside world's gaze, yet somehow, the storm found him anyway. King Alastair's eldest son, Prince Rowan, was the first to fully grasp the magnitude of the situation. Rowan had always been close to his youngest brother, protective to a fault, and yet even he was blindsided. Rowan's mind raced as he considered the implications, the future of the monarchy, the perception of the public, and the internal fractures that might emerge among their advisors and supporters. It was a complex web, and one wrong move could spell disaster. Meanwhile, the palace counselors convened in urgent secrecy. Maps of alliances, timelines of events, and correspondence that had long been stored in the royal archives were pulled out and scrutinized. Questions of loyalty, trust, and lineage dominated the discussion. Every advisor knew that one misstep, one leaked detail, could ignite a media firestorm that no amount of spin or explanation could contain. And then there was the young prince himself. Louis, unaware of the true weight of the storm, had begun to notice the tension around him. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Glances lingered a second too long, and the usual warmth from his family felt distant. For a child, these subtle shifts are confusing, even frightening. Yet, in the privacy of his chambers, he drew pictures, scribbled stories, and imagined a world where everything made sense, where love and family were uncomplicated. But reality, as he would soon learn, rarely conformed to imagination. Outside the palace, the world was already buzzing. Rumors circulated faster than the official statements, fueled by social media, speculative commentary, and the relentless appetite of an audience that thrives on scandal. Every news outlet scrambled to cover the story, often embellishing details, adding speculation, or presenting theories as facts. The truth became slippery, elusive, and dangerous. Why did this matter so much? Because at the heart of this revelation was not just a question of a child's future, but a question of legacy. Monarchies, even fictional ones, live and die by perception. Public trust, admiration, and the illusion of stability are everything. One revelation, one scandal, can erode decades of meticulous planning. And the Golden Court, despite its grandeur and apparent perfection, was about to face a test it was not prepared for. But what was the secret that had remained hidden until now? What revelation had King Alistair and Prince Rowan scrambled to understand, to contain, and perhaps to protect? It was a secret that could redefine relationships, unsettle alliances, and forever change the trajectory of the royal family. A secret that would not only impact Prince Louis, but also ripple across the entire kingdom, leaving citizens, historians, and courtiers alike questioning what they thought they knew. And yet, despite the tension, despite the fear, and despite the uncertainty, one fact remained. Life inside the palace continued. Meals were served. Duties were performed. Courtiers smiled at events. But behind the golden doors, behind the polished marble floors and chandeliers, a storm was brewing. A storm that no protocol, no tradition, and no public facade could fully contain. By now, the palace had realized that secrecy alone could not save them. Decisions had to be made. Messages had to be sent. And most importantly, the young prince's life could no longer be kept apart from the unfolding drama. The choice was clear: act swiftly or risk the story breaking in ways no one could control. The story, however, was far from over. In fact, this was only the beginning. The coming hours would bring revelations that no one saw coming, decisions that would leave scars, and a chain of events that would forever alter the Golden Court. The public would demand answers, the media would amplify speculation, and the family would grapple with questions that cut to the very core of identity, loyalty, and truth. And so, as the cameras focused on the palace gates, as whispers filled the corridors, and as the young prince tried to make sense of a world suddenly too large and too complicated, one question hung in the air, a question that would drive the next hours, days, and perhaps years of drama. What happens when the truth, long buried and carefully hidden, finally emerges? And more importantly, who will survive the fallout? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace had always been a world unto itself. From the outside, it gleamed like a fortress of stability and tradition. Tourists photographed the golden gates and manicured gardens, imagining fairy tale lives within. But inside, the corridors were a different story. A labyrinth of whispered secrets, hushed conversations, and invisible hierarchies. And it was down one of these very corridors that the first whisper that would shatter the Golden Court began. It started small, almost imperceptibly. A footman returning from a late errand mentioned it to a colleague in the kitchens. An advisor noticed a strange tension in a routine report. The whispers gained momentum, like ripples in a pond that eventually form waves strong enough to crash against the walls. By the time King Alistair was made aware, the entire palace seemed to hum with anxiety. The whispers were about Prince Louis, the youngest royal, and something so explosive it could not be contained. For Louis, the world had always been structured and predictable. He knew where to walk, when to bow, and when to smile. He knew the ceremonies, the protocols, and the smiles that hid the palace's undercurrents. And yet, in a single morning, everything he thought was steady began to tremble. His nanny noticed he was quieter than usual, a trace of unease behind his otherwise bright eyes. But she, like everyone else, did not yet know the scale of the storm approaching. King Alistair, normally composed, found himself pacing in his private study. His hands, steady for decades, trembled slightly as he reread the messages delivered by the palace secretary. The language was careful, formal, and yet it contained a weight no wording could soften. It suggested a situation that required immediate attention, delicate handling, and absolute discretion. Prince Rowan, Alistair's eldest son, was summoned. Rowan had always been loyal, protective, and deeply aware of the optics of every action. The news, however, forced him to confront a reality he had never imagined, that the youngest member of his family could be entangled in something that threatened not just his personal life, but the reputation of the entire dynasty. The palace council convened in emergency. Advisors, legal counsel, and security chiefs gathered in the council chamber, a room that had witnessed generations of decisions, treaties, and occasionally betrayals. Maps were spread, documents reviewed, and hypothetical scenarios debated. Every word mattered, because one misstep could escalate into a catastrophe. Outside the palace, the first hints of the story began leaking. Courtiers were being interviewed under the guise of unrelated events. Social media accounts hinted at breaking developments in the Golden Court, and the public grew restless. News outlets, sensing a potential scandal, began speculating, some carefully, some wildly. The story was no longer contained within the palace walls. The palace staff tried to maintain normalcy. Meals were served on schedule, events continued, and appearances were kept flawless. But the tension was visible even to the casual observer. Courtiers exchanged fleeting glances, servants moved with unusual quiet, and the young prince, despite being shielded, sensed the change. Louis began to notice the subtle differences. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Adults whispered and glanced at each other, as though he might somehow overhear. Even his siblings seemed distracted, their eyes clouded with concern. For a child, these signals are confusing, yet instinctively alarming. He did not yet understand the nature of the threat, only that something had changed irreversibly. As the day progressed, King Alastair faced a series of impossible decisions. The first was the question of communication. How much should be revealed, to whom, and in what manner? The palace had always valued secrecy, yet now the public, advisors, and international media were pressing for answers. Every decision carried consequences. Prince Rowan, tasked with helping manage both the family's internal dynamics and the external fallout, began reviewing the lineage records, correspondence, and timelines. It became clear that the situation was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Evidence of past decisions, relationships, and alliances suggested a web of complexity that no single person could unravel quickly. The palace legal council emphasized the delicacy of the matter. Laws regarding inheritance, titles, and succession had been carefully constructed over centuries, but this new development threatened to challenge precedent. Any misstep could spark disputes not just within the family, but among Parliament, the public, and international allies. Meanwhile, rumors outside the palace began taking on a life of their own. Social media amplified fragments of speculation into narratives, some plausible, others entirely fabricated. The palace's media team struggled to keep pace, issuing statements that were deliberately vague, trying to contain the story without confirming or denying specifics. But each statement only fueled more curiosity, more questioning, and more pressure. For Louis, the world had become unpredictable overnight. Though he remained outwardly composed, small signs betrayed his unease. He asked questions to his attendants, noticed his parents' somber expressions, and wondered why the palace that always seemed perfect now felt fragile. Children, even royal ones, possess an uncanny ability to sense danger, even when adults try to mask it. King Alastair and Prince Rowan knew that decisions had to be made quickly. Advisors suggested options ranging from private family mediation to public disclosure. Each path carried risks. Each risk could spiral into irreversible damage. The challenge was balancing protection for the child with preservation of the dynasty's image. Tensions escalated as the day wore on. Meetings that began with calm deliberation devolved into heated debates. Courtiers pushed agendas, security chiefs highlighted potential threats, and advisors warned of the implications for international relations. Every possibility was weighed, every scenario dissected, and yet no solution felt safe. And then came the moment that none had anticipated. The first leak from inside the palace. A document, carefully misplaced, found its way to a junior aide who, driven by curiosity and fear, shared it with a trusted contact outside. Within hours, fragments of the confidential information had begun circulating in private circles, and the palace realized that containment was no longer possible. The leak created an immediate crisis. King Alastair called for an emergency session with his closest advisors. The discussion turned to damage control, legal implications, and the potential for long-term impact. Every angle had to be considered: public perception, media response, family dynamics, and above all, the welfare of the young prince. As the sun set over the Golden Court, a sense of foreboding filled the palace. The corridors, once bustling with routine, now echoed with tension and anticipation. The young prince, unaware of the full scope of the crisis, retired to his chambers, drawing and writing to calm his restless mind. Outside, the kingdom was abuzz. Citizens speculated, journalists pressed, and social media erupted with anticipation. Everyone sensed that a revelation of monumental significance was imminent. And while the palace attempted to maintain the illusion of normalcy, the truth could no longer be held behind closed doors. The first whispers had become a roar, a signal that everything inside the Golden Court was about to change. And as King Alastair, Prince Rowan, and their closest advisors prepared for the coming storm, one question dominated every thought. How much would they have to sacrifice to protect the youngest prince? And how much could the family survive before the truth was fully revealed? But just as they began to formulate a plan, a new development arrived, one that no one in the palace had expected. One message, a single line in a seemingly mundane letter, threatened to upend everything they thought they knew. The storm was no longer coming. It had already begun, and what came next would test loyalty, trust, and the bonds of family in ways no one could have anticipated. The palace, for all its grandeur and history, was about to face a moment that would be remembered for generations. The palace was a maze of marble halls, gilded ceilings, and shadowed corners where secrets whispered from room to room. To the casual observer, the building seemed like a symbol of stability, elegance, and tradition. But beneath the grandeur lay a web of hidden passages, private chambers, and forgotten archives where truths were buried and only the brave, or foolish, dared to venture. That was where the next chapter of the Golden Court's unfolding drama began. King Alastair paced in his private chambers. A map of the palace sprawled across the antique oak table. Each corridor, hallway, and hidden stairwell had been meticulously documented for generations. Yet now these very passages felt like a trap. How had something so vital, so explosive, remained hidden for decades, and yet now, at this critical moment, surfaced with such force? Prince Rowan stood by the window, staring down at the manicured gardens below. The sunlight glinted off the marble fountains, masking the tension within the palace walls. He had spent years learning the intricacies of the court, navigating political alliances, and observing the subtle currents that dictated life in the royal family. And yet, even his experience did not prepare him for the magnitude of the current revelation. It was not just the public implications that worried him, it was the family. Every palace had its secrets, every dynasty its skeletons. But some truths, once uncovered, could fracture trust beyond repair. Rowan thought of his youngest brother, Louis, blissfully unaware of the maelstrom looming just beyond his bedroom door. Protecting him had always been his priority, but how could he shield a child from the weight of history, lineage, and scandal when the very foundations of the family were at risk? The palace archives were next on the agenda. Hidden beneath layers of polished marble floors and guarded by protocols that had changed little in centuries, the archives contained correspondence, genealogical records, and legal documents. For generations, they had been considered untouchable, yet today they were the palace's most urgent resource. Advisors and clerks pored over the records, searching for anything that could clarify the situation or offer leverage. As hours turned into an intense afternoon of research, patterns began to emerge. Letters exchanged decades ago between court officials hinted at alliances and arrangements that had never been publicly disclosed. Diaries of distant relatives revealed hints of relationships that were considered sensitive, even scandalous. Every document examined seemed to raise more questions than answers. How much of the palace's history had been deliberately obscured? And how much had been left to chance, waiting for the right, or wrong, moment to emerge? Meanwhile, Prince Louis experienced the day in fragments, unaware of the complex currents swirling around him. He noticed his father's contemplative expressions, his elder brother's distracted glances, and the subtle avoidance of certain servants who had once been familiar and comforting. Though he did not understand the full scope, he sensed that something was different. Children, especially ones raised in structured environments like the palace, are astute observers of human behavior. Even small discrepancies in tone, movement, or routine can signal change. The first private meeting between King Alistair and Rowan highlighted the gravity of the situation. "We cannot allow this to spiral into chaos," Alistair said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Every action, every word, every disclosure must be measured. The moment we lose control of the narrative, we risk more than just our reputation. We risk the very stability of the monarchy." Rowan nodded. "I understand, Father. But the more we conceal, the more the truth will find a way to emerge. Secrets have a way of breathing even when buried." The visitor's words echoed in Rowan's mind. Every layer revealed only exposes another. And as the palace prepared for the coming days, one thought dominated every mind. How much of the past could survive the light of truth, and how much of the family would survive it with their bonds intact? But as the first rays of morning filtered through the grand windows, a new threat emerged. A message from an external source, previously unknown, claiming knowledge of a detail so critical it could unravel everything the family had struggled to protect. The storm was far from over, and what came next would test every limit of loyalty, trust, and courage. The palace had long been a fortress of order, a place where every visitor, every document, and every whisper was accounted for. Yet that morning, a new player emerged. Someone who had managed to bypass the palace's layers of security, someone whose very presence threatened to rewrite the rules of engagement entirely. The hidden messenger, as he would soon be called in whispered circles, was more than a visitor. He was a catalyst, a spark capable of igniting truths long buried and secrets carefully concealed. King Alistair received the first alert personally. The security chief, a veteran of decades in service, had never sounded so unsettled. "Your Majesty," he said, "there is a person requesting immediate access. They claim to hold information critical to the royal family and the young prince. But there are no records of prior visits, and their credentials cannot be verified." Alistair's brow furrowed. He was accustomed to handling emergencies, but intuition told him this situation was different. "Bring them to the council chamber," he instructed. "But proceed with caution. This may not be an ordinary visitor." Prince Rowan, summoned once again, felt a mixture of curiosity and unease. Over the past days, the palace had been inundated with revelations, documents, and letters, each adding weight to the already mounting tension. And yet, the presence of the hidden messenger introduced a variable that could no longer be predicted, controlled, or contained. Rowan's mind raced as he considered every possibility: ally, adversary, or something in between. When the messenger was escorted into the chamber, the impact was immediate. He was not grand or imposing. In fact, his appearance suggested humility, even anonymity. Yet the aura surrounding him was unmistakable, a quiet intensity, a sense of purpose, and knowledge that went beyond ordinary observation. Every person in the room felt it, as though the walls themselves were attuned to the gravity of his presence. The messenger bowed slightly and spoke in a tone that demanded attention, yet conveyed respect. "Your Majesties, Prince Rowan, I bring truths long hidden. Truths that, if revealed recklessly, could endanger more than reputation. I am here to guide you through what has been concealed, and to ensure that the young prince's future remains secure." King Alistair, experienced and cautious, maintained his composure. "And who are you? And by what authority do you claim knowledge of these matters?" The messenger's eyes, calm yet piercing, met the king's gaze. "I have served this family in ways unseen for decades. My role has been to observe, to record, and to preserve. What you are now confronted with is only a fraction of the full story. Some truths, if mishandled, can destroy families. Others, if revealed at the right time, can preserve them." Rowan's attention sharpened. He had always respected careful intelligence gathering, but the messenger's level of knowledge suggested access that few had ever achieved. "Explain," Rowan demanded. "Why now? Why at this precise moment, with the family under pressure?" does this information emerge? The messenger took a slow breath. Because the young prince, innocent though he may be, is at a nexus of influence and consequence. Decisions made today will ripple across generations. The family's legacy, the stability of the palace, and the very perception of the monarchy are at stake. I have waited until this moment to intervene, because timing is everything. Alistair leaned forward, his voice sharp. Then speak. Reveal what you know, but understand, this is delicate. Any misstep could irreparably damage more than just our public image. The messenger nodded, producing a set of parchment scrolls from a leather satchel. Each was marked with symbols and seals long thought lost, documents from secret correspondence, hidden alliances, and agreements that predated even Alistair's ascension. He placed them carefully on the table. Every detail here is verified, every letter genuine. Study them closely. They illuminate motives, alliances, and actions that have shaped the current situation regarding the young prince. Some may shock you. Others may guide your choices. As the council chamber absorbed the weight of the information, Rowan realized that this was more than a historical record. It was a roadmap of intentions, errors, and concealed truths, offering insight into decades of family dynamics that had been deliberately hidden. The messenger's arrival had pulled back the curtain, exposing a complex tapestry of influence, secrecy, and long-forgotten pacts. Meanwhile, Lewis remained largely unaware of the machinations around him, though he noticed a subtle shift in the palace's energy. The usual routines had been disrupted, attendants whispered behind closed doors, new faces appeared and disappeared quickly, and his siblings seemed distracted. Children are remarkably perceptive, and even without understanding the specifics, Lewis felt the tension and unease that pervaded the palace. The messenger's revelations brought clarity in some areas, yet questions multiplied. Every document referenced previous arrangements, unspoken promises, and hidden relationships. Advisors debated the implications with intensity, weighing potential legal, political, and familial consequences. Some urged caution, fearing public exposure. Others pressed for transparency, insisting that proactive management would protect the young prince. King Alistair, while seasoned in diplomacy and crisis management, recognized the extraordinary nature of the situation. "We have never faced a revelation of this magnitude," he said. "It is one thing to manage public perception. It is another to navigate the consequences of truths that could redefine the family entirely." The messenger added quietly, yet with weight, "History is a living entity. What has been concealed does not vanish, it waits. And when the right, or wrong, moment arrives, it emerges with consequences that cannot be reversed. The young prince is central to this moment. Your actions now will define not only him, but the family's legacy for generations." Rowan felt the enormity of the statement. Protecting Lewis was no longer simply a matter of shielding him from public scrutiny. It meant navigating layers of history, secrecy, and manipulation, some of which had been deliberately orchestrated to protect or influence outcomes. Every decision required precision, foresight, and restraint. As the council chamber continued its deliberations, the palace itself seemed to hum with tension. Servants moved quietly, courtiers whispered in corners, and the young prince, unknowingly at the center, explored his day with innocent curiosity. Each element of the palace's rhythm had shifted, reflecting the growing complexity of the unfolding drama. The messenger, sensing the need for discretion, stepped aside. "I will remain available," he said. "But understand this. The decisions you make in the coming hours will determine how much of the truth is safe to reveal and how much must remain protected. The young prince's future and the family's cohesion depends upon careful navigation." Alistair nodded gravely. "We will act wisely. But the challenge is unprecedented. Every layer of secrecy we uncover carries consequences we must manage carefully." Rowan, reflecting on the messenger's guidance, realized that the palace's current crisis was not just about recent events. It was about legacy, power, and the intricate web of decisions made over decades. Each revelation, each hidden truth, had the potential to either strengthen the family's position or unravel it entirely. And as the day drew to a close, a new message arrived. A letter, unmarked and delivered by an unknown courier. Its contents hinted at yet another revelation, one that even the hidden messenger had not mentioned. The palace's labyrinth of secrets, it seemed, was far deeper than anyone had imagined. Louis, unaware of the weight upon the adults around him, continued to explore the palace with innocence and curiosity. Yet the threads of history, secrecy, and revelation were drawing closer to him, and soon, his world would shift in ways he could never anticipate. The hidden messenger's arrival had changed everything. The palace was no longer merely a place of tradition and grandeur. It had become a battlefield of truths, loyalties, and long-concealed intentions. And as night fell over the Golden Court, the question loomed larger than ever. How much of the past could survive the present, and how much of the family would remain intact when the full scope of revelation emerged? But just as the candlelight flickered across the marble floors, a sudden, unexpected sound came from the far wing of the palace, a sound that suggested someone, or something, had entered that no one anticipated. The story was far from over. In a palace defined by tradition, ritual, and rigid hierarchies, the arrival of an unexpected ally can change everything. That morning, as sunlight streamed through the ornate windows of the council chamber, a new figure entered the unfolding drama. Someone who had worked quietly in the shadows, unnoticed for years, but whose loyalty and insight could shift the balance in ways no one had anticipated. This was the unseen ally, a strategist, confidant, and protector whose knowledge of palace dynamics rivaled that of the king himself. King Alistair and Prince Rowan were immediately struck by the presence of this individual. Unlike the hidden messenger, whose arrival had caused curiosity and cautious suspicion, the unseen ally exuded a quiet authority, a calm that seemed to steady the whirlwind of uncertainty in the room. Every movement, every glance suggested experience, discretion, and an unshakable commitment to the family's welfare. "You've arrived at a critical moment," King Alistair said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of decades of leadership. "Your insight may be the difference between chaos and preservation. We are navigating unprecedented revelations, and guidance is required." The unseen ally inclined their head respectfully. "I understand, Your Majesty. I have observed the family, the palace, and its hidden currents for many years. What has emerged in recent days is only a fragment of what has been concealed, but it is a fragment large enough to threaten the very foundation of the monarchy if mishandled." Rowan felt a surge of relief. For days, he and the king had been grappling with documents, letters, and whispers, struggling to discern the best course of action. The arrival of someone with such intimate knowledge of palace dynamics offered a strategic advantage, but it also introduced a new layer of complexity. How much could they trust this individual, and how could their guidance be integrated into an already delicate plan? The unseen ally moved closer to the table, spreading out a set of maps, diagrams, and notes. "We must consider not only what has been revealed," they said, "but also what remains hidden. Every secret uncovered raises questions, and each question has the potential to destabilize the family if not managed carefully. Timing, discretion, and foresight are critical." King Alistair studied the maps and notes. They depicted the palace's intricate layout, private chambers, and historical corridors used for discreet communication and observation. The unseen ally had marked key locations, areas where previous secrets had been hidden, and potential vulnerabilities in both the physical and social structure of the palace. "These are paths and connections few outside this chamber understand," the unseen ally explained. "They are conduits of information, influence, and, at times, concealment. To protect the young prince and the family, we must be aware of these channels and how they can be leveraged or secured." Rowan leaned in, studying the detailed markings. He realized that the palace, for all its grandeur and centuries of history, contained networks that had been intentionally obscured, hidden routes for communication, overlooked rooms with critical documents, and even forgotten correspondences that could shed light on recent revelations. The unseen ally had mapped these elements with precision, offering a roadmap through a labyrinth that had long confounded generations. Meanwhile, the young prince, Louis, remained largely unaware of the strategic discussions unfolding in his name. He spent the morning exploring the palace, noticing subtle changes in staff behavior, the hurried whispers, and occasional glances that seemed to carry unspoken messages. Children, especially those as observant as Louis, perceived patterns instinctively, and though he could not articulate it, he sensed that the palace had shifted from a place of predictability to one of uncertainty. The council reconvened with the unseen ally at the center of planning. Strategies were discussed for protecting Louis from the escalating pressure, managing public perception, and controlling the flow of sensitive information. Every scenario was examined, from potential leaks to media speculation, and the implications of each choice were weighed carefully. One advisor raised a critical point. The information that had surfaced over the past days suggested not only family secrets, but also long-standing manipulations by those outside the immediate royal circle. There are interests at play, the advisor warned, individuals who would seize this moment to advance their own agendas. We cannot underestimate the external pressures, nor the consequences if the public perceives deception or mismanagement. The unseen ally nodded, acknowledging the point. External pressures are indeed a factor, but they are manageable if we control the narrative and act with precision. The key is to ensure that the young prince remains protected, while simultaneously addressing the revelations in a manner that safeguards the family's integrity. King Alastair, seasoned and cautious, considered this carefully. He knew that perception was as critical as reality, that the public, media, and international observers were all capable of influencing events beyond the palace walls. The arrival of the unseen ally provided not only strategic insight, but also the reassurance that every decision could be informed by experience, foresight, and discretion. Rowan, recognizing the gravity of the moment, asked, "What is our immediate priority? Where should we focus our attention to stabilize the situation?" The unseen ally's gaze was steady and deliberate. First, the young prince. His safety, emotional stability, and understanding of the situation must be managed delicately. Second, the family's internal cohesion, ensuring that loyalty, trust, and communication remain intact. Third, the flow of information both inside and outside the palace. Control what is revealed, when it is revealed, and to whom. Every step must be calculated, every action intentional. Meanwhile, Louis had begun asking more direct questions. "Why does father look worried?" he asked a servant. "Why does brother seem distracted?" The questions, simple and innocent, carried profound weight. Children's intuitions are often more acute than adults anticipate, and Louis's perception was beginning to intersect with the complex web of secrecy and revelation surrounding him. The unseen ally recognized this, emphasizing to Rowan and Alastair the importance of timing in any disclosure. "Children are sensitive to shifts in environment and mood," they said. "Even without full understanding, they react to tension. Managing the young prince's exposure to stress is as critical as managing the public narrative." As the day progressed, the unseen ally guided the council through a series of strategic simulations. Each potential scenario was mapped, including media leaks, internal disputes, and public speculation. Every outcome was considered, every contingency planned for, and every decision weighed against both immediate and long-term consequences. Despite the meticulous planning, one challenge remained unpredictable: human emotion. Even with the most carefully crafted strategy, individuals react in ways that cannot be fully controlled. Advisors, courtiers, and family members all had their own perceptions, fears, and instincts. Balancing these while protecting Louis and preserving the monarchy required not only strategy, but also empathy, intuition, and subtle influence. As night fell, the unseen ally met privately with Rowan. "The palace is a living organism," they said quietly. "Each action you take, each choice you make, resonates through corridors, hearts, and history." Protecting the young prince is not just about shielding him from information. It is about guiding the family through the revelation in a way that preserves trust, loyalty, and stability. Rowan understood the weight of the advice. The challenge was no longer simply managing secrets or controlling the narrative. It was ensuring that every move, every word, and every decision contributed to the long-term health of the family and the palace itself. And as Louis slept peacefully in his chambers, unaware of the storm swirling around him, the unseen ally prepared for the next step. A critical revelation awaited. one that would test loyalties, challenge assumptions, and force the family to confront a truth that had been buried for generations. The palace, for all its grandeur, had become a battlefield of secrecy, strategy, and survival. And as the first rays of morning illuminated the corridors, it was clear that the next move would determine not only the young prince's future, but the very legacy of the Golden Court. But just as the family prepared for the unfolding challenge, an unexpected messenger arrived with intelligence that threatened to disrupt even the unseen allies' meticulous plans. The story was far from over, and what came next would reveal truths no one saw coming. The palace, despite its grandeur and centuries of careful governance, thrived on whispers. Every corridor, every hidden alcove, every servant's passageway carried echoes of conversations not meant for prying ears. In a place built on appearances, protocol, and tradition, whispers were a weapon and a warning, a way to influence, inform, or intimidate without ever stepping into the light. That morning, the corridors seemed alive with them, as if the very walls knew that a storm was approaching. King Alistair walked through the east wing, his polished boots echoing softly against the marble floors. The earlier revelations, the hidden messenger, the unseen ally, all of it weighed heavily on him. Every decision, every disclosure, carried consequences he could neither fully predict nor control. And yet, he had always known that in a palace like this, the smallest misstep could ripple outward, creating chaos in ways unimaginable. Prince Rowan followed closely, absorbing the subtle cues around him. The furtive glances from servants, the quickening pace of footfalls in distant corridors, the soft murmur of voices that seemed to disappear as he approached. He had learned long ago that these whispers were often more telling than official reports. The room fell silent as the weight of that realization settled between them. Indeed, history had shown it repeatedly. The deeper the secret, the more explosive its eventual revelation. And the palace, for all its security and tradition, was not immune. Outside, the public's appetite for news had grown insatiable. Social media posts speculated, forums debated, and anonymous insiders claimed knowledge of events that could not possibly have been confirmed. The palace media team scrambled to issue statements that were vague enough to avoid confirmation, but precise enough to maintain credibility. Yet each message seemed to fuel the fire rather than extinguish it. The palace's legal advisors emphasized the importance of documentation. In a matter that could involve inheritance, succession, and titles, every word written, every memo sent, every conversation recorded could become evidence. They stressed caution, but caution was hard to reconcile with urgency. Speed was necessary to manage perception, yet speed increased the risk of mistakes. Meanwhile, a loyal servant named Eleanor noticed subtle disturbances. She had been with the family for decades, serving generations of royals, and her instincts were keen. Patterns of behavior had shifted. Subtle changes in schedules, whispers in previously silent corridors, and the unusual presence of advisors in rooms that were normally quiet. Eleanor sensed that the palace was on the brink of an unprecedented upheaval. Her observations proved prescient. Late that evening, a hidden letter surfaced, an envelope carefully concealed in a drawer that had gone unnoticed for decades. Its contents were concise, yet incendiary, detailing arrangements and decisions that, if revealed, could cast doubt on aspects of the family's lineage and relationships. The envelope's existence alone confirmed the fears Alistair and Rowan had long harbored. The past was not finished with them, and history had a way of returning when least expected. King Alistair reviewed the letter with his advisors. Every phrase was scrutinized, every line dissected. The implications were staggering. Not only could the information damage the public perception of the family, but it could also undermine internal trust, spark disputes over inheritance, and invite international scrutiny. The king's usually calm demeanor was strained. He had faced crises before, yet this felt different. It was personal, familial, and unavoidable. Prince Rowan began to strategize. Containment alone would not suffice. He realized that decisive action was necessary. He needed to protect his youngest brother, manage the palace's internal dynamics, and address the public narrative, all while ensuring that no irreversible damage occurred. Rowan understood the delicate balance. Every move had to safeguard both family and legacy. Louis, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the machinations around him. In his room, he drew fantastical illustrations of castles, dragons, and daring heroes, unaware that his own life was poised to become far more complex than any story he could imagine. Yet, even in his innocence, he sensed tension. Questions came unspoken. Why did father look so serious? Why did mother avoid certain topics? Why did Rowan seem distant? Children absorb these nuances instinctively, and Louis's sensitivity would soon become significant. The night deepened, and the palace settled into a tense quiet. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, security teams monitored hallways, and advisors prepared strategies that might be needed in the coming days. The weight of history pressed down on every decision, every conversation, and every glance exchanged. And yet, even as the palace tried to maintain normalcy, the truth refused to remain hidden. The letter, coupled with long-buried secrets in the archives, meant that revelation was inevitable. The only question was timing and consequences. As dawn approached, a new challenge emerged. Someone outside the immediate circle had caught wind of the hidden correspondence. A journalist, known for unearthing sensitive information, had received an anonymous tip. Within hours, the palace could no longer guarantee privacy. The first threads of public exposure were already being woven, threatening to turn a private family matter into a national spectacle. King Alastair and Rowan understood the stakes. Every plan had to account for this new variable. The palace had never faced a situation where secrecy could no longer be guaranteed, where the public, media, and international observers might act on fragmented information. The complexity was unprecedented. And in the midst of it all, Louis remained at the center, a young prince whose innocence was about to collide with the forces of history, secrecy, and power. Protecting him would test loyalties, challenge traditions, and demand sacrifices that the family had never imagined. The palace had reached a pivotal moment. Secrets once buried beneath marble floors and golden ceilings were beginning to surface, and no amount of control could fully contain them. What came next would define the future of the Golden Court, determine the trajectory of a young prince's life, and reveal whether a family could withstand the weight of its own hidden truths. But just as King Alastair prepared to act, a startling development arrived. An unanticipated visitor at the palace gates, claiming knowledge of a truth that even the king did not expect. The storm had gained momentum, and nothing would ever be the same. The palace gates were designed to keep the world out. Yet that morning, a figure approached who seemed to carry the weight of the world in their eyes. The guards, trained for protocol and decorum, immediately sensed something unusual. This was no ordinary visitor seeking a ceremonial audience or routine petition. There was urgency in the way they moved, a tremor of determination that could not be ignored. By the time King Alastair was informed, the visitor had already been escorted to a private waiting chamber. Alastair's first instinct was caution. In decades of rule, he had learned that information could be a weapon as sharp and deadly as any sword. Yet, as he observed the figure through the reinforced glass panels of the chamber, he recognized something unsettling. The visitor knew more than anyone could reasonably know. Prince Rowan, summoned immediately, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen rumors, whispers, and even the occasional breach of palace secrecy, but this was different. The visitor's knowledge was precise, specific, and, most importantly, impossible to have been obtained without inside access. Rowan's mind raced. Could the palace itself have been infiltrated? And if so, by whom? And for what purpose? The visitor was led into the council chamber, where Alastair and Rowan waited. There was a silence, heavy and palpable, as the individual bowed slightly. The visitor's eyes flicked around the room, taking in the details of the ornate space, the golden chandeliers, and the tension radiating from the royal family. Then, in a voice both calm and commanding, they spoke. "I know why you are troubled," the visitor said, "and I know what is coming next. But you must understand that time is limited, and every moment you hesitate gives the storm more strength." Alastair's eyebrows knitted together. He had always valued discretion above all else. The notion that someone could arrive uninvited with knowledge of matters so sensitive challenged every instinct he had. "And who are you?" he demanded. How did you come by this information? The visitor's gaze met Alistair's without flinching. I am someone who has been part of the court for decades, though often unseen. I have watched, recorded, and preserved truths that others preferred to ignore. And now, the truth that has been hidden for generations is about to surface. Rowan's mind raced. He knew of hidden chroniclers within the palace, but none were supposed to have any influence over current affairs. Could this be one of them? And if so, why choose now to reveal themselves? The implications were staggering. The visitor could be an ally or a threat. The visitor placed a small, leather-bound book on the table. Everything you need to know is in this book, they said. It details decisions, correspondence, and events that have shaped the current situation. Read it carefully and act wisely. Alistair hesitated, his fingers brushing over the ornate cover. It was heavier than it seemed, as though it carried not just paper, but decades of history, secrets, and consequences. Opening it could provide clarity or ignite a firestorm that the palace could no longer control. Why now? Rowan asked, his voice measured but edged with urgency. Why reveal this at a moment when we are already under pressure? The visitor's expression remained unreadable. Because timing is everything. The young prince is at the center, whether you like it or not. Decisions made now will shape the rest of his life and the legacy of the Golden Court. Delay too long, and you may lose the ability to guide events at all. Alistair finally nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Very well. You will remain here while we examine the contents. But know this, any attempt to manipulate or exploit this information will be met with the strictest response. The safety of the family and the integrity of the monarchy come first. The visitor inclined their head, acknowledging the warning, though a subtle smile hinted at a confidence that unnerved both Alistair and Rowan. The air in the chamber was thick with anticipation, the tension almost tangible. As the hours passed, the book was carefully reviewed. Every page contained meticulously documented correspondence, genealogical records, and accounts that had been hidden from the public eye. Letters between previous monarchs, personal diaries, and secret agreements painted a picture of the family far more complex than anyone had realized. One revelation after another surfaced. There were details that contradicted long-held narratives, evidence of decisions made in shadows, and hints at relationships that had been carefully concealed. Each page turned added weight to the already tense atmosphere. Alistair and Rowan exchanged glances, recognizing the magnitude of what lay before them. The palace's history was not just complicated, it was fragile and now exposed. Meanwhile, the young prince, Louis, remained unaware of the revelations taking place in the council chamber. His day had begun like any other, filled with lessons, play, and the comforting routines that structured his life. Yet subtle disruptions. The absence of familiar staff, the hurried whispers of attendants, and the unusual attention from his siblings began to prick at his awareness. Children notice patterns, and when patterns shift, anxiety follows. Outside the palace walls, the first signs of public awareness began to emerge. Observers at the gates noticed the arrival of the unusual visitor, while reporters speculated endlessly on the nature of the emergency within the Golden Court. Social media amplified the intrigue, and soon, fragments of speculation began circulating, further complicating the palace's efforts to maintain control. Alistair and Rowan realized that time was no longer on their side. The more they delayed action, the greater the risk that partial information would leak, interpreted incorrectly, or weaponized against them. Every decision had to account for multiple contingencies, balancing protection of the young prince, preservation of the family's reputation, and mitigation of potential public fallout. As evening approached, the visitor requested a private audience with Prince Rowan alone. You must understand, they said, that not all truths are safe to reveal immediately. Some must be strategically disclosed, while others must remain protected until the right moment. The young prince's welfare is paramount, but so is the legacy of your family. Rowan felt the weight of their words. Strategy had always been part of his life, but now strategy was intertwined with morality, loyalty, and the future of an innocent child. Every choice would have consequences, some immediate, some far-reaching, and some irreversible. Meanwhile, Louis, sensing the unease in the palace, began to ask questions. "Why is everyone so serious today?" he asked an attendant. "Is something wrong?" The question, simple and innocent, carried a weight that none could answer fully. The child's perception, sharp and intuitive, was beginning to intersect with the larger web of secrecy and revelation that enveloped him. As night fell, the palace settled into an uneasy quiet. The visitor's presence had introduced a new variable, one that could accelerate events in unexpected ways. Alistair and Rowan understood that the coming hours would test their judgment, their loyalty, and their ability to navigate the treacherous waters of secrecy, power, and family dynamics. And then, just as the family began to consider their next move, the visitor revealed a final, shocking detail. A piece of information so unexpected that it forced both Alistair and Rowan to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the palace, the young prince, and the delicate balance of truth and loyalty. The visitor leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. "There is someone else involved," they said. "Someone whose actions have remained hidden until now. And what they have done will change the course of this family forever." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The storm that had been quietly brewing within the palace was no longer a distant threat. It was at their doorstep. And as the family prepared to confront this new revelation, one question remained. Could they survive the consequences of a truth long buried, now finally uncovered? But just as the visitor's words settled into the room, a sudden, unexpected sound echoed from the palace gates, an interruption that no one could have predicted. The story was far from over. The palace had always been a repository of history. Every wall, every tapestry, every gilded railing held echoes of the past, carefully preserved for posterity. But history, as King Alistair and Prince Rowan were now discovering, had a way of returning uninvited, carrying with it secrets that were meant to remain buried. That morning, after the visitor's revelation, the council reconvened. The book of hidden records lay open on the oak table, and the atmosphere in the chamber was taut with tension. Each page revealed more than mere history. It revealed actions, choices, and alliances that challenged everything the family believed about itself. The advisors' faces were pale, their hands trembling as they turned each delicate sheet. Rowan read aloud a series of letters from decades past, letters exchanged between court officials, distant relatives, and previous monarchs. Some were mundane, discussing the management of estates or ceremonial matters. Others were not so ordinary. They referenced relationships, disputes, and decisions that had been concealed, carefully tucked away to protect reputations. The patterns were clear. Secrecy had been institutionalized, woven into the very fabric of the Golden Court. King Alistair's voice was measured but laced with a weight that carried decades of authority. History can be a teacher or a weapon. It appears we are faced with both. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We must understand not only what has happened, but why it was hidden. And we must decide what must now be revealed or protected. Rowan, absorbed in the documents, realized that the palace's current predicament was a culmination of choices made long before any of them had been born. The decisions of ancestors, some well-intentioned and some driven by ambition, had left the family vulnerable. Secrets that were once strategic had become ticking time bombs. Meanwhile, the young prince, Louis, continued his day in relative ignorance. He played with his toys, drew fantastical castles, and listened to stories his nanny told with gentle smiles. Yet even in his innocence, he sensed the subtle shifts in the palace's rhythm. The absence of certain staff members, the hurried footsteps in the corridors, and the occasional hushed conversation all contributed to a quiet anxiety. Children often perceive the invisible threads of tension adults try to conceal, and Louis was no exception. Back in the council chamber, advisors debated the implications of the uncovered letters. Legal ramifications, questions of succession, and the potential for public scandal were central to every discussion. One advisor pointed out that if the contents were made public, the young prince's position could be compromised. Another emphasized that withholding information could also carry consequences, as secrecy itself could be construed as deceit. King Alistair, experienced in navigating crises, understood the delicate balance. Every decision would carry weight, every disclosure could provoke reaction, and every misstep might have long-term repercussions. He glanced at Rowan, who nodded, understanding the enormity of the responsibility now resting on their shoulders. The visitor, still present in the palace, offered insight that was both illuminating and alarming. The past is not neutral, they said. It carries intention, consequence, and memory. Those who came before you acted in ways they believed necessary, yet those actions have consequences now. The young prince is caught in the middle of choices he did not make, and the timing of their revelation is beyond coincidence. Rowan considered the visitor's words carefully. Timing had always been a tool of power within the palace. Decisions about when to reveal information, whom to inform, and how to manage perception were critical. But now, the stakes had changed. The revelation was no longer a choice, but an inevitability. The family's response, their timing, and their strategy would determine the outcome. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the public remained unaware of the full story, yet curiosity was mounting. Observers at the gates noticed unusual activity. Carriages arriving unexpectedly, security personnel moving with urgency, and glimpses of advisors entering and exiting with confidential documents. Whispers spread among the palace staff, and rumors began to form in the local community. Even without confirmation, the air was thick with anticipation. Inside the palace, King Alistair made the decision to convene a private meeting with the immediate family. He understood that the young prince could not remain completely insulated forever, but how much to reveal, and when, required careful consideration. Rowan and Alistair discussed the delicate phrasing, the balance between honesty and protection, and the potential emotional impact on Lewis. As preparations for the family meeting progressed, the visitor pulled Rowan aside. "You must understand," they said quietly, "that what has surfaced is only part of the story. There are layers beneath layers. Every document you have examined so far is a piece of a puzzle far larger than you imagine. Some truths, if mishandled, could fracture bonds irreparably." Rowan felt a chill run down his spine. He had always believed that loyalty and transparency within the family were paramount, yet he now realized that even the most well-intentioned actions could have unforeseen consequences. History, it seemed, had its own plans. The young prince, meanwhile, had begun asking questions of his own. "Why is mother so quiet?" he asked his nanny. "Why does father look worried?" Children's questions, innocent as they are, have a piercing clarity. Even without knowing the specifics, Lewis sensed that the stability he relied upon was shifting.